Okay, so today I'm going to be looking at the first, I guess it's introduction to Tom Chatham, The World Turned Inside Out, Henry Corbin, and the Angel Out Ahead. And so the context for this, which is new, is well, obviously we have the empirical observation of the reality of the metacrisis and meaning crisis, diagnosed respectively by Schmachtenberger and Vervaeke. And then we have the prescription, which is again, to use Marvin Harris's framing from cultural materialism through Schmachtenberger in his series with Nate Hagens, there's infrastructure, social structure, and superstructure, um, short-term, medium-term, and long-term, or triage transition and long-term change, social change that's required in order to cope with the realities that beset us. And so my contribution is mostly in the sphere of culture, namely the superstructural layer, and all three time spans are relevant. And then within that, okay, well, what's the cultural prescription? Well, this is where Vervaeke comes in handy. We have, the prescription for like a cultural download, new cultural software that we need for humanity to maintain itself, to survive circa 21st century and achieve things like a reliable sense of um, coherence, purpose, significance, meaning, belonging, connectedness to the world, to ourselves, to nature, to the sacred, a lot of good stuff. And we do that through an ecology of intentional practices in a community of practitioners running a viable worldview that comports with different metaphysics, different ontologies, including that of science, but not limited to that. And so that's the cultural prescription, and the kinds of practices would include, like a brief framing of that would be dialogical, imaginal, mindful, and embodied practices. And that's designed to solve the meaning crisis aspect. And then within that, I would then say there's a couple of things. One of them is about, I feel that it is in the collective intelligence of distributed cognition and the co-creative problem solving of groups that proper solutions to the sort of quote unquote real problems that beset us are going to be solved. So I'm saying if we want to respond not only to the meaning crisis, but also to the meta crisis, then the practices that we practice have to involve co-creative problem solving, not just feeling a more meaningful connection to life. Not that that's not awesome, but it's like, great, once we're sort of connected a bit more to each other, can we work together to get ourselves out of the trap that we find ourselves in? Um, so intentional practice, that's obviously resting on a foundation of sociological change as well. And that's where we get Jordan Hall and the Civium project. The idea being that the incentive for cities is negated along with the internet, as in now that we can get co-creative um, wealth generation and problem solving and ideas digitally together, like now that we can meet in digital space, then the incentive for getting all these bodies into one central meeting point of the city is not there anymore. And therefore, over time, people will naturally gravitate back towards Dunbar size local tribal scale. And so that is the sociological context within which the ecology of practices, I would say, optimally plays itself out. And I think all of that is more or less necessary preamble, because until we understand the necessity for those sociological changes, and until we understand and the inevitability of them as well, and until we understand the very real sort of tidal wave of chaos and very practical physical problems that are going to, I would say, swamp the world, then it's very easy to get, if we don't understand that, then it's sort of easy to get stuck in philosophy in a certain way and to bypass from all of that. And so for me, this is all in the context of what quite obviously will be an ecology of practices with a strong emphasis on, through Jamie Wheel, stuff about so ecstasis, catharsis, and communitas, inspiration, healing, and connection. Um, so, with a strong focus on the body. So stuff including breath work and body work, teaching people how to do real practical things as well as feel better in their bodies. And then other cultural practices derived through traditions like the Platonic Academy, Pythagorean mystery school sort of thing, with more of a focus on intentional dialogue, on consciousness itself, on awareness, presence. This is all overlaid to me. Okay, and so within that context, like all of that, I think is really, I need to bring all that in for this to make sense. And so within that, we have this question of what is the role of the imaginal? Henry Corbin's The Imaginal, as distinct from the imaginary. So obviously we know that humans are we have such a profound capacity for imagination. And in our time, that's we've tended to denigrate the psyche and the faculty of imagination. And we think in terms of fantasy that takes us away from hard, cold reality, And the premise, the claim of people like Henry Corbin, Jung, and by extension, Robert Avens, Thomas Cheetham, and Vervaeke as well, is that no, the imaginal is really, really important. And the imaginal, including work with symbols and with the imagination, with the archetypes, with the dynamics of the unconscious, you could say, but also with story, with myth, with visualization, and indeed imagination, is, if we understand this rightly, then we can understand a couple of things. We can understand, first of all, how that can convey us closer to reality. How it might be possible for facility with that sphere, all of which I'm referring to with the term imagination, or I will start to use imaginal instead. Can we understand that how exactly that can take us closer to the real rather than further away? And I find it critically important to be able to answer that question. I'm someone who, I grew up on a sheep and cattle farm. My family is full of practical people, scientists, engineers, and there is a tendency for philosophy and psychology, to fit into the romantic tradition and be ridiculously ungrounded. And I feel this in myself, and I see this in people around the world. And I would say that this dichotomizing that I just described, it fits into the distinctions that we've fallen into since Descartes, or that were most obviously exacerbated in Descartes, namely between the abstract, the mental, the going up and away, toward the spiritual, toward the abstract, and then down toward the sensory, the concrete, the quote unquote real, the material. So that's one of them. The other split is between subject and object, the within and the without. And like we understand now that through modern philosophy and science, both of these splits are false. They're void. They're not the best way of looking at things. And the idea is that the imaginal and symbols, imaginal practice, a facility with participation in what Corbin calls the imaginal world, mediates those splits, and so gives us a closer access to reality. But that's still not quite clear to me, and this is why I have this questioning. How and why exactly can the imaginal bring us closer to reality rather than further from it? Is there anything else? I think I would just name the importance of the dynamics of individual and collective, I think it's very easy to spiral off into a solipsistic relativism where we can inhabit an imaginal world which is astounding, amazing, but be fundamentally cut off from sharing and cohering that world with others. There are other risks that, yeah, I think there's a dynamic here where if we don't work on ourselves, then we're full of wounds. We're full of our psyches are dangerous realms. And I think unless we have a strong focus on, yeah, inner work, then I think it's easy to be self-deceptive and delude ourselves when exploring the phenomena of the imagination and reintegrating it. I noticed, for example, that in the Islamic Sufism, Sufi mysticism that Corbin becomes interested in, these are traditions and cultures that have a lot of constraints, have a lot of dogma. And I'm actually here praising that dogma. I'm saying that there are these creative constraints for the sake of creative imagination rather than needing to choose between them. The idea being that if we don't go into these realms of the imagination without cultural constraints that derive directly from being embedded in place, in culture, in community, in tribe, if we don't have that first, then it's so easy to go astray. So I think we needed depth psychology and depth sociology first. Then once we have that, what is the imaginal? How can imaginal practice support us? How can we leverage our profound involvement in the imagination? So much of us is invested in our imagination. How can we leverage that for the sake of co-creative problem solving and survival and thriving in the world? Okay. And I'm obviously yet to answer these questions. I would like to know and I don't know. And so this is part of the reason for turning to people like Thomas Cheetham. And so hopefully after this, I won't have a whole lot to say. I'm simply going to explore and to find out, to try to understand. And this helps me get a bit of a different perspective on Jung as well, to try and diagnose what the heck's going on there. All right, so Thomas Cheetham, The World Turned Inside Out. Henry Corbin and the Angel Out Ahead. Acknowledgements. Actually, I'm not going to read the acknowledgements. I will read the preface. I bought a copy of Creative Imagination in the Sufism of Ibn Arabi because of the amazing things James Hillman had written about Henry Corbin in his 1979 Eranos lecture, The Thought of the Heart. I was immersed in Hillman's work and knew that if he thought Corbin was a master of the imagination, then I'd better find out about him. This book was written over a period of a few months in 1999. I wrote it because several years of reading had given me at best a confused sense of the world that Henry Corbin occupied, and I needed a clearer view of the life his work suggested was possible. Simple innocence and a powerful desire to understand prevented me from being constrained by the fact that I was in no way qualified to write this book. It was written with the sole intention of making Corbin's work clearer to me. I was in a state of befuddled excitement that somehow needed to be brought to ground. I thought at first that I was writing a short essay. Then it became quite a long essay. Long enough, as it turned out, to be a book. It has been a source of surprise and delight to discover that so many others in the years since it was first published have found my little guide useful. I've learned much since this introduction was published, and that has mostly been documented in the books that came later, which the interested reader may find useful. For this new edition, I've not attempted a thorough update of the references to include recent publications. However, interest in Corbin has continued to grow, and there are a number of young scholars whose work is adding to our understanding of his importance and place in contemporary thought, and some of those sources have been added. The biographical section has been updated to reflect some of this new material. The subtitle of the book has been changed because several people over the years commented that the scope of the book far exceeds the world of Islamic mysticism, and perhaps it would be wise to make this clear from the outset. It is also more in line with my own original intention. Though this book remains the only introduction to Corbin in English, there are many more resources available now than when I wrote it. The official website, Les Amis de Stella et Henry Corbin, is a superb source of Corbiniana, including a full bibliography of his works and of books and articles about him, as well as a large collection of online photographs that are a real treasure. The association sponsors an annual colloquium in Paris devoted to the implications of Corbin's thought. For many years, I maintained an online resource, The Legacy of Henry Corbin, and although my activities there have fallen off of late, it remains a repository of useful information. There is still no full biography of Henry Corbin, and this lack, perhaps now permanent in light of the death of so many of his contemporaries, is a real impediment to those hoping to reveal the significance of his work for the life of the spirit in this new century. There is much work to be done by the next generation of scholars to assure him the place he deserves among the most important visionaries of the 20th century. Books such as this will always have a limited readership, and so are often not of interest to large publishing houses. As the world of small presses evolves under the pressures of a volatile market, it is a challenge to find publishers willing to keep books like this one in print. I'm lucky indeed to have the support of Margot McLean and Klaus Otterman of Spring Publications for my work on Corbin and the creative imagination, and I'm deeply indebted to them for their dedication to my project. Okay, I'm now going to go into the introduction, firstly to preface by saying maybe something about Tom Cheetham. Tom Cheetham is an author of 5 books on creative imagination in psychology, religion, and the arts. He's a fellow of the Temenos Academy in London and adjunct professor of human ecology at the College of the Atlantic. He and his wife live on a homestead in rural Maine. They have 2 grandchildren. Yeah, so he's interested in poetics, depth psychology, and phenomenology, as we've been discussing a little bit of. He describes himself, I'm an author, teacher, biologist, and poet exploring creative imagination in human life and culture. The difficulty of describing him is somewhat akin to our difficulty with finding a place for phenomenology, angelology, Islamic Sufism, mysticism, and all the rest of this stuff in modern culture. And I think basically what I'm like, there's obviously a good interview with Viveki, among others, that Cheetham has done. And I think part of the difficulty for me here is like similar to that with Heidegger and people is that we're writing from out of an academic context. We're not writing from out of the sociological and indeed psychological context that I'm pointing to the necessity for. And I think that is profoundly limiting. I won't say more about that here. I will simply mention that I feel that the relevance of the work of people like Corbin is not yet apparent. And that in that after some sociological and psychological transformations that I feel are impending, I think it will become far more obviously relevant as a key component of the way to maintain culture. And so this is all intended to be introductory. It's obviously we're going to read the introduction. So it's like I have a strong feeling, I have a strong sense that there's something about this term imaginal and the way that Corbin is indicating that is extremely important for us. But I don't yet know what that way is. Let's continue with the introduction. Quote, Hegel said that philosophy consists in turning the world inside out. Let us say rather that this world is here and now, inside out. The Tawil and the prophetic philosophy consist in putting it right side out once more. Henry Corbin. Henry Corbin's work deserves to be far more widely known in the English-speaking world. Although much remains untranslated, many of his most important books are available in English. But his writings require familiarity with a greater diversity of subjects than can be reasonably expected from all but the most widely read scholars. He was at once a Neoplatonic philosopher, a theologian with interests in Emanuel Swedenborg and Johann Georg Hamann, Jacob Boehme, and Martin Heidegger, and an Islamicist specializing in Islamic mysticism. He was a scholar of the first rank, a formidable linguist and a prolific translator, editor, and commentator. But he was more than a scholar. He was an exponent of a kind of mystical theology that has seen its fortunes eclipsed by the rise of materialism and rationalism, and his work has significance far beyond that of most academic specialists. One obstacle for the reader is the fact that the Oriental philosophy in which he came to find his home is little known. And I do apologize if I mispronounce any terms. I hope I can be forgiven for that. Corbin's heart lay in Iranian Shiism or Shiism. For many people, an obscure branch of a poorly understood religion. It is Shiism. So the mention of Iran or of Shiite Islam conjures up for too many only visions of violence and intolerance. Yet the message that he brings from Iran and from Islam is potentially of such psychological and cultural importance as to make the effort of familiarizing ourselves with his work and the traditions from which it springs more than worthwhile. Corbin is a major source, along with C.G. Jung, for the intellectual foundations of archetypal psychology. Its work has often been on two major aspects. Its focus has often been on two major aspects of his work: the rediscovery of the reality of the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world, and the effort to loosen the grip of dogmatic monotheism on Western consciousness by disclosing the polytheistic faces of divinity. Pausing here, I'm going to find the capacity to comment throughout, apparently. So here we go. Obviously, Archetypal Foundation is the work of James Hillman, which has strongly influenced Tom Cheetham, as well as Abens and others. I think the whole point for me is that there's a lot that's in Jung that's not in Hillman. And also, I'm far more familiar with Jung than I am with Hillman, I would say. And I'm happy to admit that there's a lot in Hillman which is not in Jung. What's important here is that, yeah, archetypal psychology is by no means the be-all and end-all of everything, and I don't want to overstate its importance. I think there's a way that the work of people like Heidegger, Jung, Hillman, and Corbin, they all fit within this sort of middle sphere of trying to bring the abstract and the sensory, the interior and exterior back together. And I think getting hung up on comparisons between them is a sort of mistaking the trees for the forest or the forest for the trees kind of mistake. I also think that my work involves work with like the dualities, right? And learning how to take perspectives on those dualities so that we don't get stuck in either pole. And so when the focus of archetypal psychology is defined as sort of, quote, to loosen the grip of dogmatic monotheism on the Western consciousness by disclosing the polytheistic faces of divinity. So obviously there is a great dichotomy between one and many, monotheism and polytheism. And I think we want to be able to work with both sides of that split. Any God which is truly one is strictly speaking beyond one of many. And I don't like the, I don't think it's true that, and I don't think it's true of Corbin either, that there's an exclusive focus on the diversity and the plurality and pluralism and polytheism and the feminine chaos. I think we need the sense of unity as well. Jung, for example, talked a great deal about that. Anyway, the point of the reality of this mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world, is that it is a reality that we have forgotten, that we can rediscover, and that there are certain affordances that are unlocked, affordances to do with the maintenance of culture and life. And we're trying to discover what those are. And we're not going to be able to achieve that in this text, which is why it's a long, generations long rediscovery of the imagination. Okay. Harold Bloom brought Corbin's books to the attention of a different audience. That's Harold Bloom, Omens of Millennium, The Gnosis of Angels, Dreams, and Resurrection. His influence on poets and artists, particularly in the United States, was important and far-reaching, and his work was widely known and appreciated. That's the work of Corbin. So for the poets of the United States, he's not necessarily something completely new. Anyway, but his work is immense and complex and should be approached on its own terms. Within archetypal psychology, a good deal of attention has been paid to the lines of affinity leading back from Jung to alchemy, and to the rediscovery of classical mythologies in the Renaissance of Europe. Yet Corbin leads in other directions. While Corbin drew comparisons in nearly all of his works with aspects of the Western Christian tradition, the territory that he opened up in Islamic thought remains largely unknown for most readers. Beyond difficulties resulting from his erudition, Corbin's writings are often hard to penetrate in spite of a prose style that can be elegant and precise. One reason for this is that in Corbin's work, as Marshall Hodgson has said of the Quran, quote, almost every element which goes to make up its message is somehow present in every passage. Corbin's first major essays to be translated into English were already the product of his maturity, and one can find in them most of the themes that would dominate his thinking for the rest of his life. He amplified, modified, and added to this complex structure of ideas with each work that he produced during a long and prolific career. Each of his works repays detailed study for the light that it throws on all the others. Yet there is as yet no book in English that provides more than a brief introduction to Corbin's life and work. This book is an attempt to create a context in which his writings can be situated, highlight some of the ideas and issues that are important to an understanding of his work as a whole, and to provide references for anyone interested in pursuing the topics further. I've quoted extensively from his writings, and have tried throughout to let him speak for himself. It is by the selection and arrangement of the topics, and admittedly by their sometimes artificial separation, that I hope to provide an overview. I've tried to write the kind of short introduction that I would have found helpful in my first encounter with his thought. This is in no way intended as an exhaustive study. That would require a far larger book and a different author. My hope is that by providing some guideposts, this book will make his writings accessible to a wider audience. There is no substitute for a close reading of Corbin's own writings. If I can stimulate readers to turn to Corbin's work, I will have achieved my purpose. In surveying such an enormous opus, it would be presumptuous to pretend to completeness or to objectivity. I should say something of my biases and limitations. My initial contact with Corbin's writings came about because of interest in archetypal psychology and ecological philosophy. Corbin's work, and those aspects of the Abrahamic tradition it represents, offer an approach to the psyche and the natural world that provides a stark and illuminating contrast with that of the Western tradition. It raises and answers, for those who are able to follow it, such fundamental questions about the place of humans in nature that it would be foolish and arrogant to ignore it. Corbin's ecumenical treatment of the religions of the book suggests ways of understanding ourselves and how we have become who we are that are unobtainable almost anywhere else. Anyone concerned with the psychological, social, and ecological problems of contemporary life will find Corbin's work valuable, whether in the end they are able to adopt his perspective or not. There's now a brief biography of Corbin, which includes numerous quotations. Notice the promise that if we're interested in the quote unquote real problems in the world, that we'll find his work valuable. And the question is, in what context is that value properly realized? In what biopsychosocial context? Okay, brief biography. Even a quick sketch of Corbin's life reveals a capacity for philosophical research and diverse interests that are breathtaking. He was born in Paris on the 14th of April, 1903, to Henri Arthur Corbin and Eugénie Fournier. His mother died 6 days later. His health was fragile in his early years, and he was frequently forced to interrupt his studies. He showed a strong affinity for music and studied organ and theory. Corbin attended the monastery school at St. Maur, later the seminary school of Issy, and received a certificate in scholastic philosophy from the Catholic Institute of Paris in 1922. In 1925, he took his licence de philosophie under the great Thomist Etienne Gilson, as in St. Thomas Aquinas, Thomist Etienne Gilson, at the École pratique des Hautes Études, sorry for the French, in Paris, at a place in Paris, with a thesis entitled Latin Avicennism in the Middle Ages. Corbin was entranced by Gilson's scholarship and his ability to bring medieval texts to life. Gilson was then beginning his own study of the role of Islamic philosophy in the development of scholastic thought in the West. Corbin admired him immensely and took the master interpreter as his model. He writes, quote, "This was my first contact with Islamic philosophy. I discovered there a complicity between cosmology and angelology. And this angelological concern has not, I believe, left me during my entire life." Again, if one doesn't understand the use of the term angel, then one has to refer to Viveki, the episodes that I've published in the new Gnosis series on the divine double, or Viveki's sacred second self, Socratic daimonion, Jungian anima, or Corbin's angel, all correspond. So the fact that there is a deep connection between cosmology and angelology should not necessarily be a surprise, at least from our vantage point. During the same period, he attended Émile Brehier's lectures on the relation between Plotinus and the Upanishads. How could a young philosopher, quote, how could a young philosopher avid for metaphysical adventure resist this appeal to study deeply the influences or traces of Indian philosophy in the work of a founder of Neoplatonism? A notorious period of mental asceticism followed on his decision to undertake the simultaneous study of Arabic and Sanskrit. Asceticism. In 1928, Corbin encountered Louis Massignon, the director of Islamic studies at that same university in Paris. The contrast with Gilson's methodological and rigorous style was incredible. Quote, "It used to happen that a lesson would commence with one of the flashing intuitions of which the great mystic Massignon was unsparing. And then a parenthesis would open, and then another, then another. Finally, the listener found himself stunned and bewildered, arguing with the master about British politics in Palestine." Corbin's proclivity for the mystical element in Oriental studies was confirmed by contact with Massignon. Quote, there was no escaping his influence. His soul of fire, his bold penetration into the arcana of mystical life in Islam, where no one had before penetrated in this way, the nobility of his indignations at the cowardice in the world, all of this inevitably made its imprint on the spirit of his young listeners. It was Massignon who first turned Corbin's attention to the writings of Shihab al-Din Yahya al-Surawadi, or Surawadi, the Iranian theosopher of the Oriental Light, whose writings were to affect the course of his life. So just briefly to summarize, we've been talking about the origins of Corbin's influences, namely the Thomist Etienne Gilson, and then the Islamic philosopher scholar Louis Massignon, both of whom he encountered in Paris while he was doing his thesis on Latin Avicenna, Latin Avicennism in the Middle Ages, and while he was studying Arabic and Sanskrit. And so this guy, Massignon, had a big impact on him, and then he discovered the writings of Surawadi, who's a, quote, Iranian theosopher of the Oriental Light, who, and we're going to quote about that now. Quote, thus it was that one day, it was, I think, in the year of 1927-28, I spoke to him, that's Massignon, of the reasons that had led me as a philosopher to the study of Arabic, questions that posed themselves to me concerning the connections between philosophy and mysticism, and that I knew, through a scanty resume in German, of a certain Surawadi. Then Massignon had an inspiration from heaven. He had brought back from a trip to Iran a lithographed edition of the major work of Surawadi, translated The Oriental Theosophy, or Hikmat al-Ishraq, I would pronounce that. With commentaries, it formed a large volume of more than 500 pages. Take it, he said to me. I think there is in this book something for you. This something was the company of the young Shaykh al-Ishraq, who has not left me my whole life. I had always been a Platonist, in the broad sense of the term. I believe that one is born a Platonist as one is born an atheist, a materialist, etc. Unfathomable mystery of pre-existential choices. The young Platonist that I was then could only take fire at contact. The young Platonist that I was, the young Platonist that I was then could only take fire at contact with the one who is the, quote, Imam of the Platonists of Persia. Through my meeting with Surawadi, my spiritual destiny for the passage through this world was sealed. Platonism, expressed in terms of the Zoroastrian angelology of ancient Persia, illuminated the path that I was seeking. There's an important footnote here which reads, John Walbridge and Hossein Ziai have challenged the interpretation of Surawadi that Corbin shares with S.H. Nasser and others. They're critical of Corbin's Gnostic approach and emphasize the philosophical aspects of Surawadi's teachings in their translation of Surawadi's Hikmat al-Ishraq called The Philosophy of Illumination. They write, quote, Corbin's interpretation is expressed not just in his studies of Surawadi, but also in his translations and even his critical editions of Surawadi's works. The use of renderings like Theosophy and Oriental indicate the fundamentally mythological mythological focus of Corbin's interests and interpretations. His translation of The Philosophy of Illumination omits the logic, and his editions of the three peripateic works omit the logic and physics of each work, and contain only the sections on metaphysics. That's the sections on metaphysics found in the work of Surawadi, whereas there are other works about logic and physics. Other sections. Such methods inevitably downplay the strictly philosophical aspects of Surawadi's thought. Okay, so there's important pushback. Anyway, we're moving on to Corbin's life. There were no longer any doubts about the direction the main lines of his research would take, and he began the study of Turkish, Persian, and Arabic. As if this was not already enough for several lifetimes, Corbin's interests extended nearly as far in other directions. He never considered himself primarily an Islamicist, or a philologist, or a scholar of scholasticism, or of modern Western philosophy. He was a philosopher pursuing a quest. At the age of 70, he wrote, quote, "To be a philosopher is to take to the road, never settling down in some place of satisfaction with a theory of the world, nor not even of a place of reformation, nor of some illusory transformation of the conditions of this world. It aims for self-transformation, for the inner metamorphosis, which is implied by the notion of a new or spiritual rebirth. The adventure of the mystical philosopher is essentially seen as a voyage which progresses towards the light." His own quest was not confined to the study of Islamic thought. During the 1920s and the early 1930s, he simultaneously pursued studies in that in and of themselves would have clearly marked him as a brilliant and eclectic Protestant theologian. He became deeply engaged with the German theological tradition, what he would later call the lineage of hermeneutics. Jacob Boehme, Martin Luther, Johann Georg Hamann, Friedrich Schleiermacher, Wilhelm Dilthey, Martin Heidegger, and Karl Barth. In 1931, he was a co-founder, along with two Protestant pastors, of a short-lived periodical called Hic et Nunc, a journal for theological renewal, inspired by the early writings of Barth. He lectured and delivered papers on Luther, Kierkegaard, and Hamann, at the same time publishing translations of Surawadi in 1933, 35, and 39. He was also the first to translate the early works of Barth into French. Isn't it something interesting? Corbin's friend, the pastor Roland de Pury, wrote this about him. Quote, "This Corbin is quite the most erudite man I've ever met. He's baffling. He knows French, German, Italian, Spanish, English, Arabic, and Persian, and enough to read Sanskrit, Turkish, Dutch, Swedish, and Latin. He is immersed in Arabic mysticism and is familiar with every turn of contemporary German philosophy and theology, all the representatives of which he knows personally. But above all knowledge is for him directly linked to his immediate existential task. That is, he hates history when it is other than a presentation of things and men. And he revolts vehemently against so many psychological, cautious, and unreal French methods. Simply said, he is a Christian. He is quite a rare and benevolent French type." That was Roland de Pury writing about Henry Corbin in a letter to Eric de Montmolin, 21st of August 1932, in Roland de Pury, Letters d'Europe. Happens to be one of my ancestors. Anyway, let's move on more about Corbin. His interest in Eastern Christianity led him eventually to study Syriac, Aramaic, and Russian. That's incredible. Anyway, the central place of Russian thought in Corbin's intellectual and spiritual development, particularly the work of Nikolai Berdyaev, has been elucidated admirably by Foucault, a scholar, who thereby provides a crucial missing piece to our understanding of Corbin's thought. In that same year, on a trip to Sweden to meet with H.S. Nyberg and Georges Dumézil, Corbin stopped at Lake Siljan in Dalekarli I guess in Sweden, where he recorded some of his most intimate meditations. Quote, "It will soon be dusk, but for now the clouds are still clear. The pines are not yet darkened, for the lake brightens them into transparency. And everything is green, with a green richer than pulling all the organ stops in recital. And everything is green, with a green richer than pulling all the organ stops in recital. It must be heard seated, very close to the earth, arms crossed, eyes closed, pretending to sleep. For it is not necessary to strut about like a conqueror and want to give a name to things, to everything. It is they who will tell you who they are, if you listen, yielding like a lover. For suddenly for you, in the untroubled peace of this forest of the north, the earth has come to thou, visible as an angel that would perhaps be a woman. And in this apparition, this greatly green and thronging solitude, yes, the angel too is robed in green, the green of dusk, of silence, and of truth. Then there is in you all the sweetness that is present in the surrender to an embrace that triumphs over you. At each moment where you read in truth, as now what is there before you, where you hear the angel and the earth and woman, then you receive everything, everything, in your absolute poverty. You are the poor one, you are a man, and he is God. And you cannot know God or the angel or the earth or woman. You must be encountered, taken, known, that they may speak. Otherwise, you are alone. He rarely committed such personal experiences to writing, and this short piece serves as an important glimpse of the mystical sensibility that underlies all his works. The writings of both Luther and Hamann profoundly affected Corbin's understanding of Islamic mysticism. The primary importance of Luther was to provide insight into the contrast between the revealed and hidden God, and into the meaning of significatio passiva, the presence in us of those characteristics by means of which we know God. Again, quote, the primary importance of Luther was to provide insight into the contrast between the revealed and the hidden God, and into the meaning of significatio passiva, the presence in us of those characteristics by means of which we know God. Hamann provided the foundations of a, quote, mystical hermeneutics, which was central to Corbin's philosophical development. But it was his reading of Heidegger's Being and Time in 1930 that was to be the defining moment in his struggle to grasp the meaning of hermeneutics as the science of interpretation. The two met for the first time in Freiburg in 1931. Corbin traveled there again in 1936 to submit the first French translation of any of Heidegger's works, which was to appear in 1939. He tended the Oriental collection at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris beginning in 1928. In 1933, he married the woman who was to be his lifelong companion, Stella Leonhard. In 1939, they traveled to Istanbul for what was intended to be a 6-month stay to collect manuscripts for a critical edition of Surawadi. Corbin served as the only member of the French Institute of Archaeology there until the end of the war. When his replacement arrived in September of 1945, the Corbins left Istanbul for Tehran, and arrived on the 14th of September in the country, quote, the color of heaven. In November, Corbin was instrumental in launching a project to create a department of Iranology in the new Institut François. They returned finally to Paris in July 1946. In 1949, he first attended the Eranos conferences in Ascona, Switzerland, where he was an important figure until his death. In 1954, he succeeded Massignon in the chair of Islam and the religions of Arabia. The three major works upon which his reputation rests in the English-speaking world were first published in French in the 1950s. Avicenna and the Visionary Recital, Creative Imagination in the Sufism of Ibn Arabi, and Spiritual Body and Celestial Earth. The work that is generally regarded as his magnum opus, as yet untranslated, is the 4-volume En Islam Iranien, Aspects Spirituels et Philosophicals, which I won't attempt to say in English, which appeared between 1971 and 73. From the 1950s on, he spent the autumn in Tehran, winter in Paris, and spring in Ascona. In 1974, he and a group of colleagues, including Gilbert Durand and Antoine Favre, founded the University of St. John in Jerusalem, the International Center for Comparative Spiritual Research. This organization operated until 1988, with 14 volumes of proceedings published by Berg International in Paris. Corbin's contributions are in the first 5 proceedings. His life was spent teaching, writing, lecturing, and editing critical editions of Persian and Arabic manuscripts. His published work includes over 200 critical editions, translations, books, and articles. He presented his last paper in June 1978, Eyes of Flesh, Eyes of Fire, The Science of Gnosis. He died in October 7 of that year, and thus was spared the anguish of witnessing the chaos into which Iran was plunged. Well, that was a brief biography of Henry Corbin, which serves as an introduction to the rest of Cheetham's book, The World Turned Inside Out. Henry Corbin. It's Henry Corbin and the Angel Out Ahead.